If you're following, you're already seeing sort of the point-counterpoint nature of our songs this morning. Paul Simon with his song on the sort of the existential crises of every day, sort of just the problems and struggles and lack of clear understanding of what we're all about from day to day, or sometimes when we start to question them because of whatever's going on. And so there's this playfulness with him. But all of us, with our own orientations to faith and the traditions of faith that we bring to this moment, or that we bring to every Sunday when we come together, or that we bring to crises when we experience them, all of these sort of faith moments, and Peter Mayer in his song sort of challenges. You cling to things, but you also let go of things. We learn how to cling, but we need to also let go. I had a great experience the other day. And someone came up and said how much they really appreciated some of the ideas that we've been talking about in this series of becoming human, how to be human. And they had said that they were really feeling so much more excited about these new ideas, these new insights. And I said, that's great. And then I looked at their face. I could see this sort of excitement. And I said, now, let go of it, throw it away. And then they just turned and walked off. No, they didn't. They actually looked at me like, that would have been depressing, wouldn't it have been? No, I mean, but it's this idea, in the old Zen tradition, it was sort of like when the student came up and said, I think I finally understand, the Zen master would pick up a stick and hit him over the head, right? I mean, it's like, wake up. It's never one thing, and yet there is a way in which we are present to this presence of God we call the ground of our being, to the river that flows in and out of our lives, to these moments that when instead of feeling repetitious and like we're trapped, there's an invitation to be a different way. So last week we talked about these emotional patterns and how they happen in us because it's part of our brain science, it's part of our neurobiology that these reactions that we have towards things, these stances we take on things, these emotional responses to different events in our life, to stressors and such, these things are happening in us pre-consciously, pre-cognitively. Our brains are designed, since the very beginning of our evolution, are designed to run away from woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. No time to think, right? So when we need to do something, we need to do it fast. The brain is already kicking in the adrenaline. Already the heart is pounding. The brain itself, less blood going to the brain, so rational thought starts to go out the window. Just think about rational thought and fear, for example, and ask yourself, when those people who say, I'm not saying anyone in here, but we know a number of people who are afraid of flying, right? Just afraid of flying. The idea of getting in a plane is just scary. But they're not afraid of all of getting on the highway or eating a cheeseburger. Right? I mean, we're afraid of the wrong things most of the time. But the reason for that is because our brains, again, these neurotransmitters are triggering based on patterns. And our brain, especially our amygdala, but our brain in general, is like Velcro for negative thoughts. That's just where it tends to go first. Until we begin to practice this idea of being aware of things. The very thing that Sharm was doing, this very breath work, is a part of the mindfulness practice of learning how to sort of begin to take control of when we feel the trigger start to happen. You're in a conversation with someone, and you know immediately that they're holding a stance that you don't approve of. They're saying something that's already starting you've subconsciously got these anxieties already ticking off. Your brain is already acting. And before you know it, you're already reacting. So what we have to do is we have to remember to come back to the present, to begin to center and figure out what is triggering that, and to remind ourselves that that's not who we are. That may be the emotion at the time, but that doesn't tell the whole story. And sometimes it doesn't tell the story of what's going on in that relationship. When Phil Connors gets stuck in this Groundhog Day experience, we get to see what happens to Phil Connors in one concentrated 24-hour period. Roger Ebert, when he reviewed the film, he called it a parable for the modern man back then, or for the modern person. I mean, it was basically what we would experience throughout different parts of our lives. Every one of us knows what it means to experience shame, or we felt guilty, or we felt afraid, or we felt defiant, or we felt joy. I mean, we all know these emotions, but we don't experience them all at once. We experience them in the midst of other things. We get excited, we get intense, we get afraid, we get stressed out. We find a way to sort of deal with it for a while. But then we find ourselves later on that week, later on that day, later on the next week, we're back in that same place. We're reacting to that same situation again. We have the same response. We have the same self-doubt that we can't seem to shake. We have the same anxiety about this that we can't seem to shake. We have this same sense of shame that we can't seem to shake, or this sense of failure. All of these things become patterns because that's the way the brain works. But they're not who we are, even though there are our emotions. Our stories are bigger than that. We are just simply trapped. Phil Connor gets to experience all of that without all of the little breaks, all the little rescue moments, all the little escapes. He gets to experience it all at once in 24 hours, over and over and over. And so what we get to see is we get to see him exert every single sort of egotistical response he can. Everything that he can try to, and when I say egotistical response, you know what I mean. I mean every effort to control the situation, to manipulate the situation, till it almost gets ridiculous. At first, he's in a panic, and he tries to control it, and he walks in after 2 or 3 days of this, and he walks into a bar, and he sits down next to a couple of guys who've been there for a while, and he looks at them, and he says, have you ever had one of those experiences where it just seems like no matter what happens, you're in the same place, with the same people, you're having the same experience day after day after day? And one guy looks up at him and says, yeah, that pretty much sums up my life. And that pretty much sums up the whole sort of thrust of what this story is about. He can't seem to shake it. And so then he approaches it with anger. As you saw, he gets more aggressive with people. And when that doesn't seem to change anything, he can't shake this pattern. He can't shake this loop until he finds himself trying to end it, right? Because that's somewhat where a lot of us go. We try to end it in some way, sometimes drastically in the most extreme ways, sometimes with just a substance or a drug or perhaps a practice or perhaps some other kind of relational kind of pattern. We try to stop it by numbing it, by distracting it. Again, we're trying to control what's going on with us. We feel, when something makes us angry, we feel something out there made us angry. When we're scared, we feel something out there made us scared. But the emotions are not out there. The emotions are in here. The feelings are not out there. The feelings are in here. Now somebody had said last week, well, some people have serious anxiety orders. Are you just saying, no, you don't? Is that what I'm saying? No, you don't. You don't have those disorders. It's all in your head. I mean, it sounds like that's what I'm saying. Emotions are real. Feelings are real. We can't avoid feelings. There's nothing bad about feelings in and of themselves. They're part of who we are, part of our brain, our neurological makeup. It's how we let feelings define who we are that becomes the problem. It's when we don't begin to practice our lives in the presence of others as well as on our own, when we don't practice them mindfully, but instead we are operating mindlessly, which is kind of how we all operate. And thank God for that. Sometimes I don't want to think about all the things involved for me to sit down or stand up. I don't want to be that preoccupied. I don't want to have to think about how I'm pouring coffee when I can turn and look at somebody and still know what I'm doing. My brain is already operating without me. I like that. But when our emotions get the best of us, what happens is we find ourselves not just in polarized settings, we find ourselves in defensive settings, in aggressive kinds of responses. Or, in the case of Phil, utterly depressed, finally, at some point. There's no way to change this pattern. But we get the benefit of seeing Phil Connor in this 24-hour repeated. It's like putting a rat in a jar or in a little cage, and we get to see the experiment take place in a concentrated form, because after going through all of this, how many hundreds and hundreds of times in a period of 2 hours he goes through this, things begin to happen. Phil realizes what we might come to realize as we start paying attention over the months and years of our lives that we've done these things, Phil begins to realize he can't do anything. He's exhausted everything, exhausted every attempt at trying to control and eliminate it. And so he starts to simply pay attention. He starts asking Ned about his life. He starts not just listening to Rita so that he could try to get in a relationship with her and maybe get her to go to sleep with him. Instead, he just starts to pay attention to her. And Roger Ebert says something really wonderful. He says something that Phil does that is really, truly marvelous. The story never exactly says what Phil does to change it, but suddenly he wakes up on February the 3rd, and everything's now different, even though it's still the same crowd. But what Roger Ebert says, there's a clue when he looks at Rita, and he says, I don't see you, I see an angel. And it's not the fact that he called her an angel that Roger Ebert says is so amazing. It's the fact that he's finally shed so much of his outer onion. He's exhausted it in so many ways and peeled himself down to basically his vulnerable core self, that now he's beginning to see how things are connected. Now he's beginning to see something bigger than himself. Now he's beginning to see the ground of our being. So I want to suggest for you just a couple of things, 4 quick things that I think we can do with this. Paul has this wonderful text, and I love it, and it is the Message that was read. It was the Message version, so you can go back and read that. In fact, if you pick up your bulletin, this might be kind of fun to do. Pick up your bulletin and you read along as I share with you how I think we read this from a mindful, ground of being way of thinking about it. Don't allow your default emotions to control you. Pay attention to the moment. Practice mindfulness. Take a curious stance toward any and all emotions and be intentional about it. Be awake to the very ground of your being, to the place and the frame of your mind where we recognize that we are not limited stories and moments. We are part of something much larger than us, something that involves everything. What would it mean to wake up to that connection by challenging our emotional patterns? So you take your moment-to-moment doubts, your moment-to-moment fears, your guilt, your shame, your go-to default negative emotions, and you put them in the context of the universe, in the context of the interconnectedness of all things. And now what do we see? So the first task for us to deal with these patterns, Phil can throw that up there, is recognize when the pattern comes, right? Recognize it. Begin to recognize when your gut starts to feel a little tinge, when your shoulders start to tense up. How do you do that? Well, you start having to practice it. You start having to pay attention to it all the time. You have to intentionally lay yourself out by being present to it. So the first task is to recognize when this pattern comes. In the next slide. And to tell yourselves, this is something that I read the other day that I think is a great phrase. My emotions are not me, but mine. My emotions are not me. I am not my emotions, but I have emotions. That's so hard to let go of because our brain is entrained with these patterns. And so if we're in a negative pattern, we tell ourselves that's who we are. We can't get out of it. We have to begin to force ourselves to pay attention and to remind ourselves, I'm not my emotions, but they're mine. I can own them. The second thing I think we have to do is we have to recognize this is a part of everybody. This is a part of everybody. This is a part of your enemy. This is a part of the person you most despise. This is the part of the person you don't know, but you're in line and suddenly they're losing their temper. Or the person who's cutting you off on the highway. Or the person you're talking to in a friendly conversation, but you have no idea all of the immense troubles and crises they're going through at that moment. It's a part of who we are, this tendency to default to emotions. And because of that, we can see our moments with one another, as an experiment in noticing. Part of paying attention, part of being present, is to intentionally notice others. Not judgment, but just notice others. Allow yourself to be in the presence of others, even with whom you might disagree, with this willingness to say, we're all in this same emotional boat together. What would this be like to notice what's going on without judgment? The third thing that ties into this is to let go of the outcome. Because that's where we get trapped. When the person came up to me and said, I'm finally happy, I can figure this out. Let go of that. The outcomes are fine, but they're what they are. As soon as we start experiencing some moment, we keep telling ourselves that's the moment we need to get back to. But we forget the moment we're in. So let go of the outcome. It doesn't have to be anything. We simply have to pay attention to where we are in the moment and to be vulnerable in that moment and to experiment with that moment in a curious way. Let's see. So here's the idea. You choose a bigger story, right? The idea of trying to get to the outcome is this idea that everything has to be fixed. And the reality is that things are never fixed, not permanently. There are very few of us that are that lucky that life is going to be beautiful and perfect and happy and the most glorious, secure, safe place that we've ever been in our whole life. If you haven't figured it out, you're going to die. I know, I'm sorry, I really bummed you out now. The reality is that we're all mortal. We're all finite. We're all going to have these ups and downs. That's part of just life. But even when life is perfect, we're going to experience loss. We're going to experience the threat of our loss of our own reality, of our own way of life, of our own physical life. And so we have to learn to choose a bigger story. And that bigger story is more about journey, is more about intentionally being awake, as Paul would say, waking up to the moment. Where is God in this moment? When someone always comes up and says, wow, you were listening to me, this was the most amazing thing. It must be God. This must be a God moment. This has just changed my life. And I'm like, no, you just started paying attention. They're all God moments. But we have to choose to live with adventure and curiosity. And finally, the fourth thing is look for the redemptive moments. We have to, I think it's a part of our faith as people of the ground of being, as people who follow Jesus' teachings. I think it's part of our faith journey to trust in redemptive possibilities. That when things aren't the way we think they should be, that we should just remind ourselves we will always be surprised by what's possible. But we won't. We'll experience that more deeply and richly and consistently when we look for those moments intentionally, when we believe that redemptive moments are possible. God moments are possible all the time. So one of the things that Phil does at the end is he's peeled back. He's completely opened up. Nothing else is working, and he gives in to the moment. What would that be like for us to stop fighting some of these moments, to realize and remember we're bigger than these moments, and then to be curious, to center ourselves, take a deep breath, and be curious at just what's possible in these moments that we're not seeing. Amen.